There's another royal baby on the way. Princess Beatrice is expecting her first child with her husband, Edoardo Mapelli-Mozzi.
The whisper that started it all. The palace has always existed in a fragile balance between grandeur and silence. Behind its heavy oak doors and centuries-old portraits, the air carries whispers, soft, dangerous, and often true. But even among walls that have seen kings rise and empires fade, few whispers have struck so deep as the one that began on a quiet spring morning. It started in the archives, deep beneath St. James's Palace, where only a handful of people are permitted to work. There, an unassuming file, unlabeled, misfiled, and coated in the dust of decades, was discovered. Contained within was a short video clip, time-stamped but undated in its metadata. The footage showed a small meeting in what appeared to be a restricted royal office. Two men were speaking in low tones. One of them was unmistakably Edoardo Mapelli-Mozzi, Princess Beatrice's husband. At first glance, it seemed routine. Papers exchanged, a signature here, a nod there. But when cross-referenced with financial records from a long-dormant royal fund, the implications became severe. The account, originally established to support charitable trusts connected to the late Queen's initiatives, had been drained slowly over the years, millions gone unaccounted for. Prince Edward, the one who stumbled upon the footage, reportedly froze as the realization dawned. A man known for his discretion and loyalty, he understood instantly that the discovery could either protect the monarchy or destroy it. After a sleepless night, he made the choice few would dare. He quietly handed the file to senior advisors, bypassing traditional channels. From that moment, the whisper began to spread like smoke under a locked door. Palace officials were summoned at dawn. Confidential meetings followed. Within 24 hours, the footage had been viewed by the king's private secretary, 2 auditors, and a royal legal consultant. Within 48 hours, the footage had been encrypted and stored in a digital vault under the highest security classification. By the 3rd day, Beatrice's name entered the conversation. When she was told, witnesses recall the silence that filled the room. She reportedly sat still, her expression fixed, her hands trembling only slightly as she asked to see the footage herself. "No," an aide replied, "for your sake, it's better you don't." Outside the palace, the world went on unaware. The press was chasing other stories, fashion, engagements, the quiet hum of royal life. But inside those walls, tension simmered. The footage had exposed a connection between Edoardo and a consulting firm tied to a network of financial entities, one of which had handled royal assets years earlier. When Beatrice confronted her husband, it was said to be late at night in their London home. Curtains drawn, lights low, her voice was barely above a whisper. "They say there's proof." Edoardo's reply was measured, almost weary. "There's always proof when they need a villain." But she saw the flicker of fear in his eyes. Within a week, security clearances were quietly revoked. Edoardo's access to certain royal documents and private events was suspended, pending clarification. In the coded language of royal bureaucracy, it meant exile without accusation. No statement was made, no denial offered, only a quiet void where his name used to appear. Behind closed doors, Edward's decision became a source of division. Some praised him as a man of conscience, others accused him of disloyalty. "There are things one does not reveal," an old courtier muttered. "Not for the family, not for the crown." But Edward, haunted by what he'd seen, could not be silent. He had always believed that secrecy preserved dignity, but this secret, he felt, preserved decay. Days turned to weeks. The walls of Buckingham seemed to tighten around those who knew. When Beatrice appeared in public, her smile was porcelain, her composure immaculate. Yet the strain was visible in the stillness of her eyes. She carried the quiet dignity of someone torn between truth and love, between loyalty to her blood and to her marriage. Inside, the royal machine moved with chilling precision. Lawyers drafted non-disclosure agreements. Accountants re-examined every line of every ledger. And through it all, one question remained unspoken. How had the money vanished, and who had decided it was better for the truth to disappear with it? The footage had become both a weapon and a curse, proof of something no one wanted to define. And so the whisper grew, stretching through the palace corridors and beyond. A secret found, a marriage strained, a prince burdened with the weight of revelation. No one yet knew it would end with a royal ban, a quiet erasure from the life Eduardo had married into. But even now, the first ripples have begun. The monarchy once again was holding its breath, shadows over Sandringham. Autumn fell like a sigh across Norfolk, and with it came the uneasy calm of waiting. Sandringham, the royal retreat known for its solitude and rituals, became the setting of a quiet storm. What should have been a season of respite was instead filled with whispers, tension, and the faint sound of doors closing softly after hurried conversations. Prince Edward's decision to expose the footage had created invisible fault lines. Family dinners that once echoed with laughter now carried the cold weight of formality. Eyes darted, voices lowered. There was no shouting, no confrontation, only the royal art of silence, sharpened over centuries of survival. In early October, a small convoy arrived unannounced at Sandringham. Inside were auditors, legal advisors, and the private secretary to the king. They came not for counsel, but for containment. For hours, they examined accounts linked to the vanished royal fund, a sum once thought secure, reserved for charitable trusts established under the late Queen's oversight. What they found unsettled everyone. The money had not vanished in one grand theft, but through a slow erosion spread over years. Funds were moved, consolidated, and reallocated until nothing remained but traces of paper trails leading to long-dissolved entities and dormant foundations registered in faraway jurisdictions. Among those signatures, one name appeared again and again, a consulting firm linked to Edoardo Mapelli. The documents date years before his marriage to Beatrice, during his earlier career as a property developer and advisor, yet to those examining the evidence the timing did not matter. His name was enough to ignite suspicion. That evening, as the wind swept across the Sandringham gardens, Beatrice arrived in a black coat, her face drawn with quiet anguish. She met Edward privately in one of the smaller drawing rooms. Candles flickered between them as she spoke, her voice unsteady. "You've done what you thought was right," she said. "But do you know what it costs us?" Edward, always the calmest of his siblings, seemed older than his years. "Truth costs less than silence," he replied. "Silence, Beatrice, is what ruins families." Their conversation lasted an hour, but its echo carried further than either imagined. Courtiers whispered that Beatrice left in tears while Edward sat long after, staring at the dying fire. Outside that room, alliances were shifting. The king had been briefed. He demanded restraint, no leaks, no statements, no mention to the press. "This family," he said, "does not survive through scandal. It survives through control." Yet control was slipping. In London, a small circle of senior aides began drafting what insiders would later call the Containment Protocol. It outlined steps to quietly limit Eduardo's visibility: removal from royal rosters, restrictions on media appearances, and a suspension from all events classified as state or semi-official. There would be no announcement, no punishment declared, only absence. Eduardo himself had already withdrawn. Friends said he spent days in his study taking long phone calls, canceling meetings, and refusing public invitations. "He knows what's coming," one acquaintance remarked. "He's been around power long enough to recognize exile when he sees it approaching." Meanwhile, the royal household's private financial office worked without rest. They uncovered transfers to foreign accounts connected to foundations once considered dormant. Each time they traced a path, it ended in an administrative dead end, a corporate name dissolved, an address abandoned. It was not theft in the ordinary sense. It was the kind of disappearance only bureaucracy could conceal. Prince Edward's own standing grew uncertain. Some within the palace saw him as a liability, honorable but naive. "There are truths," a senior aide confided, "that cannot be told without unraveling everything." And so Edward found himself both praised and quietly distanced. Invitations to minor engagements ceased. His calls were returned less often. He too was learning the price of transparency. Beatrice, meanwhile, bore her burden with visible grace. She attended a children's hospital opening in Leeds, arriving alone, dressed in navy blue. Cameras captured her gentle smile, but the photographs told another story. Her eyes red from a sleepless night, her hand clutching her clutch too tightly. Newspapers speculated, but the palace offered no clarification. By December, Sandringham was draped in frost and silence. The royal family gathered for the annual Christmas service, a ritual of image and endurance. Beatrice stood between her sister and mother, her smile faint but unwavering. Eduardo was nowhere in sight. Reporters noted his absence. Courtiers refused comment. The king's face, stoic and distant, betrayed nothing. But those inside the family circle understood. The decision had already been made. Eduardo Mapelli Mozzi was, in effect, barred, not by decree, not by statement, but by omission. He would not attend royal gatherings. He would not stand beside his wife in official portraits. And his presence would be quietly erased from the visible story of the crown. Later that night, after the festivities ended and the palace grew quiet, Beatrice sat alone in her room overlooking the estate. Snow drifted across the window pane, pale and silent. She thought of her husband miles away and of Edward, the uncle whose integrity had cost them peace. In that moment, she understood what all royals eventually learn, that in this family the truth is rarely forbidden, but it is often unwelcome. And as the candles burned low in Sandringham's great hall, the shadows seemed to lengthen, not from the light, but from the weight of secrets too heavy to keep buried. The leak and the lineage. By the turn of the new year, what began as a whisper had evolved into a slow, dignified crisis. The story of the vanished royal fund lingered like an uninvited ghost, haunting corridors and correspondents alike. There was no official confirmation, no denial, only the measured silence of a palace guarding itself against implosion. Yet silence, as history has proven, has a strange way of creating its own noise. Prince Edward, the reluctant whistleblower, found himself standing at a crossroads. His discovery had not only fractured the delicate balance of royal unity, but it also put him under suspicion. There were those within the household who believed his intentions were pure, and others who saw his actions as dangerously naive. In the monarchy, loyalty is not measured by truth, but by discretion. A few trusted staff members began to question how the footage had come to exist in the first place. Palace offices, especially those handling finances, were monitored but rarely recorded. The answer, it seemed, traced back to an internal audit commissioned years before the Queen's passing. The cameras were meant to ensure accountability, though few had known of their presence. It was one of those forgotten, unreviewed things that Edward had stumbled upon. The footage itself remained locked away, viewed by fewer than 6 individuals. Those who had seen it spoke carefully, as if describing a dream that might vanish under scrutiny. It showed a meeting brief, professional, but suspiciously timed. Eduardo Mapelli Mozzi, impeccably dressed, appeared to be discussing contracts with a royal aide known to have handled financial transfers. There was no incriminating dialogue, no explicit wrongdoing, only the faint impression of something that should never have happened behind closed royal doors. But in the court of perception, suggestion is often enough to convict. It was a midwinter evening when the leak occurred. A freelance journalist contacted a tabloid editor, claiming to have proof of a buried royal scandal involving financial misconduct and forbidden footage. The source was unnamed, but the details were alarmingly precise. Within hours, the palace's press office received inquiries. Someone had spoken, someone inside. Edward was summoned to an urgent meeting with the king's private secretary. The conversation was clipped and tense. "Your Highness," the secretary said, "we need to know whether you shared the file beyond protocol." Edward, startled, denied it. "I gave it only to those authorized," he insisted. Yet his voice trembled, not with guilt, but with the fatigue of a man trapped between duty and family. Behind the palace gates, crisis management moved into overdrive. Lawyers drafted statements ready to deny without denying. Public relations specialists prepared language that could contain a scandal without admitting to it. The instruction was clear: speak little, concede nothing, maintain dignity. The monarchy had survived divorces, affairs, and abdications, It would survive this too. Beatrice, however, was unraveling. She had endured months of whispers, isolation, and headlines she dared not read. But now, with the press closing in, her private grief became public speculation. One tabloid accused her husband of embezzling royal fortunes. Another hinted that Edward had betrayed his niece by exposing her marriage. The cruelty was surgical. In private, Beatrice clung to composure. She refused to release a statement and refused to cry in front of the cameras. "If I speak," she told a friend, "it will not be for their entertainment." Yet behind her calm exterior, exhaustion gnawed at her spirit. She wrote nightly letters to Eduardo, letters she never sent. For his part, Eduardo maintained his innocence. Friends and colleagues described him as quiet, withdrawn, yet unwavering. He never once said he was guilty, one confidant later revealed. But he did say it doesn't matter. Once the court of public opinion decides, the truth becomes irrelevant. That line captured the tragedy of it all. When the story finally broke in a subdued form with a brief article suggesting financial irregularities under review, the palace responded with its trademark restraint. A statement released at dawn read simply, "We do not comment on internal audits or family financial matters. The royal household maintains full confidence in its processes." It said nothing and everything at once. Still, the damage was done. Invitations stopped arriving. Royal protection officers were reassigned. Eduardo's once visible role as a modern link between monarchy and enterprise evaporated. He was not officially condemned, yet he had been effectively erased. Edward, consumed by guilt, withdrew from the spotlight. Those close to him said he spent long hours walking the gardens of Bagshot Park, his thoughts heavy. "I tried to protect the crown," he confided to a friend, "but in doing so, I may have wounded it." Within the family, opinions hardened. The king believed Edward's act had been necessary but mishandled. Others, especially those with longer memories, believed it unforgivable. Beatrice found herself caught in a web of politics older than her marriage. Her mother, Sarah Ferguson, offered comfort, but even that felt fragile. "The palace has its way," she told her daughter quietly. "It forgives when it forgets, and it never truly forgets." The phrase lingered like a prophecy. By late March, Eduardo received the formal notice. He would no longer attend any royal event, public or private, deemed of state significance. It was phrased politely, almost kindly, yet its meaning was final. He was, in all but the title, banned. The public never heard the words, but inside the palace, they carried the weight of exile. Eduardo Mapelli Mozzi, businessman, husband, father, and royal by marriage, was now an absence more powerful than presence. And as spring sunlight returned to London, it illuminated a truth that no crown could hide. The monarchy, once bound by blood and duty, had fractured along invisible lines. The footage remained unseen, the money unaccounted for, and the family forever changed. In the stillness that followed, even the portraits on the palace walls seemed to watch in silence, as if aware that history was quietly rewriting itself once again. Beatrice's quiet rebellion. Spring returned to London, but the air around the royal circle felt colder than ever. Scandal has a way of staining without sound. No declarations, no public trials, just an unending stillness that makes the silence louder than any accusation. By April, Princess Beatrice had grown accustomed to that silence. It followed her like perfume, subtle yet suffocating. She began attending engagements alone. Each appearance was carefully planned, every word measured, every smile a shield. The press described her as composed, graceful, resilient, yet none of those words captured the truth. Beneath her calm surface, she was fighting a private war, to protect her husband, to defend her name, and to preserve what little dignity remained amid whispers she could not silence. When she spoke at a children's charity event in Manchester, her voice trembled only once. "Sometimes," she said, "we must continue walking forward even when the ground beneath us shifts." The audience applauded warmly, unaware of how much she meant it. Behind that poised delivery lay sleepless nights and unanswered calls. For months, she had pleaded for transparency, an internal statement, a chance for Eduardo to clear his name. But every attempt met the same response: not advisable. The monarchy's strategy was simple: erasure. If Eduardo disappeared from public life, the story would fade. His absence would be the cure, but for Beatrice, that silence had become unbearable. In a rare moment of defiance, she approached the palace's private council herself. The meeting was brief, her tone respectful but firm. "If justice exists," she told them, "it must be visible. My husband deserves to defend himself before history writes him guilty." No reply came. They simply thanked her for her understanding and escorted her out. Even so, something had shifted. For the first time, Beatrice refused to retreat into the shadows. She began speaking more openly at her events, not about the scandal directly, but about resilience, truth, and the cost of silence. "There are times," she said during a literacy campaign in Bristol, "when silence is mistaken for peace, but silence can also be surrendered." The audience heard inspiration. The palace heard rebellion. Meanwhile, Eduardo lived in quiet exile at his family's countryside estate. The man who once thrived in London's high society now spent days wandering through gardens, writing in a worn leather notebook. Friends said he had stopped reading the papers, stopped answering questions. Yet those who visited him said he spoke of Beatrice often, how proud he was of her grace, how sorry he was for the burden she carried. Then came the envelope. One morning, a plain brown envelope arrived at the offices of a major British newspaper. Inside was a typed document with no signature, no watermark, just a transcript of an internal inquiry. The document claimed that the missing royal funds had not been embezzled, but reallocated decades earlier to cover losses from a failed overseas investment. The transfers, though technically unapproved, were done under pressure to shield the monarchy from public embarrassment during a politically volatile period. The implication was staggering. The money had vanished not through theft but through desperation, and the scandal was not about greed but concealment. Eduardo's role, it appeared, was incidental. His consulting firm had processed documents related to the investment's closure, unaware of their true origin. The story hit the press like a thunderclap. Headlines read, "Royal Scandal Reconsidered a Cover-Up, Not a Crime." The tone shifted overnight. Where once Eduardo's name had been whispered with disdain, it now returned with a question mark. The palace, however, said nothing. Their silence was as strategic as ever. But within those walls, the atmosphere changed. Some senior aides quietly admitted that an injustice might have been done. Others, more cautious, warned that reopening the case would only rekindle unwanted attention. Beatrice did not speak publicly, but those close to her noticed the difference. At her next appearance, her smile seemed lighter, not triumphant, but relieved. She had not won, yet she no longer carried the weight of absolute loss. In private, she wrote a letter to Edward. "You acted out of conscience," she began, "and though it cost us both, I no longer resent the truth. It was never the truth that hurt us, it was how those in power feared it." Edward replied days later, his handwriting steady but weary. "Truth," he wrote, "is like sunlight on marble. It shows every crack, but without it, the stone decays unseen." As spring ripened into summer, Beatrice and Eduardo's paths began to converge again. They were seen dining quietly in a small countryside inn, far from London's cameras. Witnesses described the moment as tender, no drama, no confrontation, just two people rebuilding something fragile yet unbroken. Still, the rift between them and the royal household remained. Eduardo's ban was never lifted, and Beatrice's invitations grew fewer. But her independence, once questioned, now drew admiration. To the public, she was no longer the quiet princess standing behind her husband. She had become something rarer, a royal with a voice, unafraid to use it. And as the sun set over the palace one June evening, those within the inner circle began to whisper again, but this time the tone had changed. Not scandal, not suspicion, but curiosity. Had the family gone too far in its attempt to bury embarrassment? And if so, could Beatrice's quiet rebellion become the first ripple in a long-awaited tide of change? The monarchy, for all its restraint, had always been slow to forgive. Yet history has shown that even the oldest institutions can tremble when faced with truth spoken softly but persistently. In the corridors of Buckingham Palace, servants swore that on certain nights they heard Beatrice's name mentioned with respect, not pity. And though the official record would remain unaltered, the private memory of her defiance would endure, carried quietly by those who witnessed it. The princess who once bowed to silence had learned that sometimes the only way to protect a legacy is to challenge the hands that guard it. The royal reckoning. Summer waned into autumn, and the palace, ever stately, ever polished, resumed its rhythm of ceremonies and carefully crafted appearances. Yet behind its perfection, a quiet reckoning was unfolding. The scandal that began as a whisper had forced the monarchy to look inward, not for fault alone, but for understanding. For the first time in years, the family found itself asking what honor meant when silence had become its shield. The internal inquiry, months in the making, finally reached its conclusion. The report, sealed and circulated among only a handful of senior figures, confirmed what many had begun to suspect. The vanished royal fund had not been stolen. It had been mismanaged for decades, shifted between outdated trusts and poorly recorded accounts, until its paper trail vanished in a tangle of bureaucracy and pride. No single individual was found responsible. The auditors used delicate language, cumulative administrative oversight compounded by generational transitions. But between the lines, it was clear those in charge had chosen secrecy over transparency, protection over honesty. The monarchy had not been betrayed by outsiders. It had betrayed itself. Edoardo Mozzi's name appeared only twice in the report. Both mentions were brief and exculpatory. He had acted as a consultant, unaware of the fund's true origin. He had not profited, nor concealed, nor schemed. The footage that had caused so much turmoil, it turned out, had captured a conversation stripped of context, an innocent exchange buried in implication. When Beatrice received a private copy of the report, she read it in silence. By the end, tears blurred her vision. It was vindication, yes, but also heartbreak. Months of doubt, humiliation, and whispered suspicion, all for what? A clerical tragedy wrapped in royal pride. Edoardo was formally cleared in writing, though no public announcement was made. The palace chose discretion once again. His exclusion from royal duties remained for the foreseeable future. The decision was explained in a single phrase: to preserve public confidence. In other words, innocence did not erase scandal. It only quieted it. Prince Edward, the man whose conscience had set everything in motion, faced his own reckoning. Though his intentions were finally acknowledged, his role had fractured relationships that could not be mended. For a time, he disappeared from public view, appearing only at small charity events and regional visits far from London. Those who met him said he seemed lighter yet lonelier than a man who had told the truth but paid its full price. At a private family gathering later that year, Edward and Beatrice crossed paths for the first time since the storm began. They exchanged a few words. Theirs was not a reconciliation born of apology, but of mutual recognition. Both had been wounded by the same truth. Both had survived it. When Beatrice rose to leave, she placed a hand briefly on his shoulder and whispered, "It's done." Edward simply nodded. For the rest of the world, the royal family appeared unchanged, smiling from balconies, christening children, cutting ribbons, maintaining the pageantry of continuity. But inside those walls, something had shifted. Advisors began insisting on modern oversight for the family's charitable trusts. Independent auditors were hired. Quietly, the monarchy took steps toward transparency it had long resisted. And yet, the emotional scars remained. Beatrice and Edoardo moved forward in their own way. They spent most of their time away from London, living quietly, raising their daughter and hosting small gatherings among close friends. When the press occasionally spotted them, they appeared content to be two people who had learned that survival within royalty meant redefining freedom beyond it. They were, as one journalist wrote, royal in name, private in soul. The footage that had started it all was locked away once again, filed under restricted classification, its contents known only to those few who had once dared to view it. It would never be released. It had already done its work, breaking silence, revealing weakness, and forcing one of the oldest institutions in the world to confront its reflection. For Beatrice, the ordeal had transformed her. The young princess, once known for timidity, had become a woman of quiet authority. She no longer sought validation from the press or protection from the palace. Her composure carried something deeper, now a peace earned through fire. When asked years later about those difficult months, she simply replied, "The truth hurt, but it healed." Eduardo never spoke publicly about the ordeal. When asked by a close friend whether he regretted marrying into the royal family, his answer was immediate. "No," he said, "because love survived what power could not." Prince Edward, too, found a strange peace in solitude. His act of revelation, once branded reckless, came to be remembered in private as an act of integrity. He believed, said a confidant, that the monarchy must endure, but not at the expense of its soul. As autumn light filtered through Buckingham's windows, the palace seemed unchanged, golden frames gleaming, portraits watching, the same rituals unfolding as they had for centuries. Yet beneath the surface, something enduring had shifted. Transparency, once an enemy, had become a necessity. And so, history would record it not as a scandal, but as a reckoning, a quiet correction in an ancient institution that had momentarily lost its way. The royal family would never speak of the vanished fund again. But among those who lived through it, the memory lingered not as shame, but as a warning. In the stillness of evening, when palace lights dimmed and the world outside fell silent, Beatrice often stood by the window of her home, watching the city stretch beneath her. In her reflection, she saw not the princess the press once pitied, but a woman who had learned that truth, no matter how costly, was the only inheritance worth keeping. And in that fragile peace, the crown endured. Truth, loyalty, and the silent battles behind the crown, every secret leaves a scar. What would you sacrifice for honesty inside a world built on appearances? Share your thoughts below. Subscribe for more royal revelations and stay tuned. In the House of Windsor, even silence has its story.